And so tonight we are very excited to be here with musician and writer Tim Stegall. Tim is the frontman of the band The Hormones. He is a prolific and accomplished music journalist. And our reason for being here today is also his ongoing series, Austin Punk Chronicles, which promises to be a comprehensive history of punk in Austin. There are a couple of different small histories of this scene that take one or another decade or moment. Tim has bitten off the whole thing. He's going to do the whole thing. It's being serialized in the Chronicle as we speak. We're up to about 7 installments so far?
It's going to be the 6th one next week, part 1 of chapter 6. Well, let me think. No, part 1 of chapter 5.
You keep splitting the chapters, which messes me up.
Well, no, they're always going to be in 2 parts. I mean, the only one that wasn't in 2 parts was chapter 4 about the events of 1977. But no, next one's going to be chapter 5, and first part of that is going to be running next week in the Chronicle.
Started this in 2019. You've also got Substack just now up and running.
It's the future of independent journalism in this world right now. You're basically, you are your own publisher and editor, delivering your writing to a paid subscriber base. It's emailed right to your email box. There's also a website that you can go to.
Give us the name.
Mine is timnapalmstegall.substack.com. I was asked back in December by the Joe Strummer estate to annotate a comprehensive box set compiling all his recordings with the Mescaleros.
I feel like every time I talk to you, there are a few things that stop me in my tracks, and that Joe Strummer liner notes announcement was one of those.
It just got announced yesterday that it's going to be called Joe Strummer 02 because the first box set was just Joe Strummer 001 or something. This is Joe Strummer 002, the Mescaleros. Out September 16th through Dark Horse Records. Yeah, Joe Strummer is signed to George Harrison's label, everyone.
What was your road into the Austin punk scene? When was punk as a movement something that you were aware of and drawn to?
I grew up in a little town called Alice, Texas, near Corpus Christi. For all intents and purposes, I was the punk scene in Alice, Texas. I'm walking around in Sex Pistols t-shirts that I hand-painted myself because, I couldn't get them down at Kroger. And, I'm pretty, these people used to ask me questions like, so who listens to these bands besides you? I would tell them, they actually press up exactly 1 copy of each of these records just for me. I am the sole means of support for this music worldwide. I think those fuckers believe me. But, my first inkling that there was a world beyond those city limits was watching the Sex Pistols on the evening news when I was like 12 years old when they came to America. David, you probably remember this yourself. Didn't Walter Cronkite look like he wanted to throw up every time he had to say the name Sex Pistols?
Now you're dating me.
Well, what I was about to say was my mom and dad were not going to let their 12-year-old boy go see the Sex Pistols. They'd seen the same Walter Cronkite newscast. Oh, no, you don't, young man. But as I always say, I could get away with seeing somebody with as innocuous a name as Patti Smith 6 months later in Corpus Christi. Just what Mom and Dad didn't realize was that almost the first words I was going to hear out of Patti Smith's mouth were, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. Wait a minute. You can say these things in a pop song? Patti Smith represented freedom to me. I did not have to listen to my parents. I did not have to listen to my school principal or my teachers. I did not have to listen to the preacher who was preaching a bunch of nonsense at me. I could live a creative life. I could be whatever I would determine myself to be. And I think that was one of the most important lessons I could have learned. Just as a side note, 25 years later, I'm living in New York City. I am playing guitar with my friend Sammy Yaffa, who used to be in Hanoi Rocks, at a Johnny Thunders tribute at CBGB's. And I come off the stage, and Lenny Kaye walks up to me, the guitarist for Patty that night, and said, "Tim, I need a bass player." "Lenny, I'm a guitar player." "We're playing Gloria." "Oh, I can play that." I got to make a direct connection with the guy that was playing guitar on that song the very night that I saw Patti Smith and had my life changed. But what really changed my life the following year was seeing the Clash at the Armadillo. I was 14 years old, standing on Mick Jones's side of the stage and looking up at him jumping around in a 1956 Elvis Presley haircut and rockabilly clothing with a black Les Paul custom around his neck, and I want to be you when I grow up. The Clash are the reason I do everything I do. They're the reason I'm a punk rock musician. They're the reason I'm a punk rock journalist and now historian in my old age. That band felt larger than life, and I have not seen a band since that touched the vibe that you got off of the Clash. It was like, you know, those guys were fairly slight except for Paul Simonon, and it felt like they were 6 feet tall. It was like your cool cousins from London had just walked over and walked in the room and said, "Here's how you walk, here's how you talk, here's how you comb your hair. Why don't you take your belt buckle and put it over on your hip just like Paul is doing. There's this really cool music that you can find in your parents' record collection. We like it a lot. It's called rockabilly. Oh, did you hear this stuff that sounded like some sort of weird calypso that we were playing before we walked on it? It's called reggae. It's out of Jamaica. You should check this out. By the way, here's what's going on in the world. Here's why your leaders are not doing a good job, and maybe here's a few books you should read." I haven't seen a rock and roll band that provides that sense, and that was just a life-changing moment for me. And I kind of keep hoping somebody's going to come along that can give me that same vibe. I keep looking. I mean, this is why I do what I do.
So your first kind of segments of that Austin Punk Chronicles, Rocky Erickson, sort of the first person that you bring to the fore. So how do you frame him as kind of a bridge figure, as someone who is like in those same punk waters?
Well, you also have to look at the guy who produced that record, which was Doug Song. I mean, you know, everybody acknowledges that the roots of 70s punk rock was the 60s garage scene. And the 13th floor elevators are it here in Austin. But my old friend Tim Hayes, who started the Hormones with me, said to me, "Man, the elevators were kind of like the Sonics on acid, weren't they?" And he's absolutely right. I mean, it's just this raw, you know, Kinks-like expression, but, you know, filtered through, you know, however many microdots you got in 60s acid of, you know, LSD. You know, but yeah, you know, it starts with the elevators, obviously, but then, you know, you get into Austin in the 70s, and as I point out, everywhere else in the world, there's all these bands, you know, that are composed of the local freaks who were like the only people in their town that bought the Stooges records and the New York Dolls records, and you know they're just trying to play the music that they want to hear because they're not hearing it anywhere else. About a year later, they kind of look around. Wait a minute, that band in Cleveland is called the Dead Boys is doing something similar to us. You know, it's like the Sex Pistols are playing their gate crashing their first gigs at the same time that the Ramones are walking onto the stage at CBGB, and down in Australia, Radio Birdman and the Saints are at opposite ends of the continent doing something very, very similar. None of these people are aware of each other until the following year. And then somebody like Caroline Kuhn at Melody Maker, or wherever it was she worked for, names it punk rock. It was a term that had been around for a while. Dave Marsh used it in Cream in writing about a question mark in the Mysterians reunion in 1969. And of course, Lenny Kaye, here we go back again, he puts together a compilation of what we now know of as garage bands for Elektra Records called Nuggets, and the phrase he uses to describe this stuff is punk rock. It was a term that had been in currency. Lester Bangs used it a lot, and I will parenthetically say Lester Bangs is the reason I'm a writer, the same way that Johnny Thunders and Mick Jones are the reasons I'm a punk rock musician. About the same time that I'm first discovering this music, I start picking up Cream magazine. He was gone from Cream by that point, unfortunately, but then the following year I got the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll, and Bangs had several essays in there, but there's one he wrote about the British invasion, and it had the one phrase that made me a Lester Bangs fan for life. He was writing about the Dave Clark Five, and he said, rock and roll at its core is nothing but a bunch of raving shit. That's my man. He's speaking my language. I get exactly what he's talking about. You know, it's like supposed to be the most disposable crap in the world, and yet it's the very it's the very stuff of life itself. You know what I mean? And you know, I always felt like Lester Bangs wrote the way Johnny Thunders played guitar. You know what I mean? He captured the spirit of the music. You know, you were asking me about Rocky. Well, Rocky gets out of Rusk State Mental Hospital. They put him in an insane asylum for having a joint. What the fuck? Okay? What the fuck? Seriously. What are you thinking, state of Texas? He's not well. There are various theories as to why. But he's getting back into playing music. He starts writing these songs that are basically based upon the horror movies and, you know, the bloody pre-code EC comics that he grew up on. And it's all stripped down rock and roll. It's like even more abrasive and to the point than the Elevators were. And Doug Somm is seeing what Rocky is doing, and he decides he's going to help him. You know, these are two figures from the counterculture that knew something was happening. But they couldn't quite name it, but they decided they were going to participate, maybe even help shape it. And they recorded this blistering, just noisy slice of Yardbirds-style rock and roll called Two-Headed Dog that was released independently. It is Austin's first punk rock record at a time when Austin music meant Waylon and Willie and the boys down at the Armadillo, or else the Fabulous Thunderbirds down at Antone's, and there's nobody doing this vicious 1970s stripped-down rock and roll inspired by the Stooges. But this is this record comes out about the same time as Little Johnny Jewel by Television, or Piss Factory by Patti Smith. This is our first punk record, and then it takes 2 years for us to have an actual punk scene.
You also point out in the piece that Rolling Stone, what do they review it with? It's a joint
They review it with Anarchy in the UK.
Right, it's a joint review saying a new thing is happening, Rocky Erickson and the Sex Pistols. Right?
They have put those two in as an example of what is happening here. They did an article just shortly before then up in the front of the magazine about the scenes both in New York and London at that point. The Sex Pistols hadn't yet sworn on television, but they were about to. And yeah, they reviewed Anarchy in the UK together with Two-Headed Dog in that issue. you know, it's chapter 1. I had the great discovery in that one was, you know, this story that Sean Somm told me about his father meeting the New York Dolls. So Doug recorded this album for Atlantic Records called Doug Somm and Friends in 1973, and the entire cast who played on the album is flown up to New York City to play 3 nights at Max's Kansas City. And you know, they put the cast up at the Gramercy Park Hotel, very famous hotel downtown. And so of course, they're in Max's Kansas City. Guess who's standing in the back some of those nights watching Sir Doug? Well, right in the middle of that run, Sean tells me that they're in Doug's suite at the Gramercy Park Hotel, and Rocky Morales, the incredible San Antonio R&B saxophone player, comes running into Doug's room. "Hey, Doug! There's some tall blonde dude in a nurse's uniform standing outside." As I wrote, nothing in San Antonio's rough and tumble R&B scene could have prepared Rocky Morales for the sight of Arthur Killer Kane, the New York Dolls bass player. This gentleman right here, Mr. Bevis Griffin, posts some photos of a glam rock band that he was in Austin in the early 70s called Franklin's Mast. Bevis, you mean to tell me there was glam rock in this town? And by the way, one of the people who's a frequent voice in this book, Eddie Munoz, would be killing me right now if he heard me calling it glam rock. We call it glitter rock, he yelled at me when I was trying to interview him for the book. But yeah, so that ended up being chapter 2. That had to be inserted into the book. You know, yes, there was a band called Cracker Jack that might have been the first around here. And they were basically kind of our version of Rod Stewart and the Faces in many, many ways. The rhythm section was Johnny Winter's old rhythm section. Uncle John Turner and Tommy Shannon on bass guitar, who later ended up in Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble, had this incredible, you know, singer named Bruce Boland. Oh yeah, this is Bruce Boland to the right. Over here we have Steve Metter, who was the guitar player of a Dallas band called the Werewolves that was, you know, the other real paragon of Texas glam rock. There was a scene statewide that is just never written about. But here in Austin it was definitely represented by Cracker Jack, Franklin's Mast, and later a band called Jelly Roll that featured a bass player named Jesse Sublette, and a guitar player named Fast Eddie Munoz. Jelly Roll were kind of the last of the breed, and you know, that's the bridge to Austin punk rock right there. But you know, it was short-lived but glorious. Now the sad part about it is I had to write about these bands without being able to hear them. None of them recorded. I think you and Jimmy Swaraj told me both. It's like, yeah, we just kept expecting labels were going to come to town. Nobody was recording demos or things.
Not to interject, but there was just a paucity of recording facilities in the city, first of all. And then those that existed were cost prohibitive. So unless you did have, you know, supplemental finances from a label or quote unquote managerial benefactor, most of which were drug dealers, but you really didn't have immediate, you know, access to recording facilities, so it was very difficult.
Yeah, so I mean, this is, and you know, as it is, if you know anything about punk rock history, glam rock folds right into punk. I mean, I think I wrote in there that it was kind of the hangover of glam. It's like what would have happened if, you know, Ziggy Stardust wakes up the following morning after the neutron bomb is dropped, and his clothes are all shredded. He's hungover from the night before. You know, he's been doing poppers and speed and drinking champagne. His clothes are all torn up. His hair is all messed up. And he looks out the window and, you know, the entire landscape is blown up. So this is the kind of music he's going to make now. And I mean, there could be an argument made that punk rock in its original form was just ugly glam.
It really kind of was.
Yeah. And then, you know, so what happens around here is Two-Headed Dog comes out, and then kind of nothing. It's like everybody that ends up starting a punk band, they're going to see Roxy Music when they come through town. They're going to see John Cale or the Runaways or whatever. Inner Sanctum. We got Neil Ruttenberg up front and Richard Dorset, the late Richard Dorset. These were the guys that were ordering all the indie punk records and all the imports from England.
Is that Joe Bryson at the back?
That is Joe Bryson at the very back. He was the owner. It was like the most successful independent record store in the country before it became punk rock central in this town.
It was the music scene. It was the ground zero of the music scene.
It was. It originally was the basically, yeah, clearinghouse for the progressive country scene. But yeah, these two guys here wanted to do something else, and from what Neil Ruttenberg told me, they were kind of like the Clerks in High Fidelity. What the fuck are you doing buying that? No! No! Here, you want to hear this band called the New York Dolls. Apparently they were literally doing that to people. But they ended up influencing a lot of tastes.
Let's get to the big bang that you're kind of leading up to here, which is that there is this sort of glam glitter rock scene. There's a lot of like people who are a little marginalized. You've got Rocky Erickson doing his stuff, but most of these narratives kind of go through the Sex Pistols' Southern tour, and for the Austin scene, that means the San Antonio show at Randy's Rodeo in the beginning of '78. So here, I'm going to read actually what you write about it. You say, the Sex Pistols' Randy's Rodeo gig was a catalyst for Austin's scene. The same way their summer 1976 gig in Manchester was the spark that ignited the Buzzcocks, Joy Division, the Smiths, the Fall, and Factory Records. Virtually everyone who was part of Austin's initial punk scene was at Randy's Rodeo, as they likely were 2 weeks later when the Skunks and the Violators inaugurated Punk Nights at Raoul. So tell me a little bit about who was in the room at Randy's Rodeo. We got some people who were in the room there, in the room here, right? So we've got a couple of perspectives.
He was at the Dallas show.
The Longhorn Ballroom.
Yeah, with the Nerve Breakers opening. But, well, there were a couple of bands that formed concurrently here in Austin that hadn't played their first gigs that were all down there, and that being the Violators and the Skunks. Kathy Valentine, later of the Go-Go's. Jesse Sublette, he was in both the Skunks and the Violators. Carla Olson over here ended up in a band called the Textones out in Los Angeles. Marilyn Dean passed away about last year. She really didn't do much after the Violators, unfortunately. But they were all there. Lewis Black, the founder of the Austin Chronicle, was there. He apparently went from a wedding reception for James Cooper, the manager of Inner Sanctum Records, where Alvin Crow and the Pleasant Valley Boys were playing, and then he drove down to see the Pistols, and as he put it, half the people that were at that wedding reception were in the Randy's Rodeo parking lot to greet him. But there was like this caravan almost. Margaret Moser is there with her boyfriend, Ken Hogue. Margaret nearly got hit by Sid Space.
This is one of the dean of Austin music journalists, like Margaret Moser.
Margaret, it felt like Margaret greeted me the minute I walked into the Austin Chronicle offices for the first time in '91, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But no, one of the bands opening was called the Vamps, and their singer was this 7-foot-tall dude who moved like Mick Jagger on a stretch rack, named Frank Pugliese, who has fronted the Sons of Hercules since 1991. He will probably die on stage with the Sons of Hercules. They were all there. We got a photo somewhere here of Kathy and Marilyn actually at, there they are at Randy's Rodeo wearing their Homemade Violators t-shirts. if we go back, we're going to get a panoramic view. Kathy is somewhere in here. You apparently can also see Sally Norvell somewhere near, although I can't. Eddie Munoz, who came up with the Violators and the Skunks in his VW bus, he was standing pretty much almost center stage. He's there with Ty Gavin from the Next. Oh yeah, I also should add that Buff Parrott and Glenn Taylor from the Dicks were there. They were both San Antonio boys.
And again, none of these bands exist yet.
A student at San Marcos named Larry Seaman is there. Members of a band called the Crayolas are all there. They were supposed to bring along the bass player's younger brother, Jeff Smith, but Barry, their bass player, and Jeff's older brother stole his ticket and gave it to somebody else. Jeff is still holding a grudge, I might add, about the fact that he didn't get to see the Sex Pistols.
He never told me that.
He told me that.
That's what I heard.
But, yeah, there are basically bands forming.
What about the one that floored me? Are you saving that?
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, there's an unknown country singer who grew up in San Antonio by the name of Steve Earle who was there. Steve has said that seeing that show made him decide, you know, after he'd been learning how to write songs from Guy Clark and Townes Van Zandt, he decided to pick up the electric guitar all over again because he saw the Sex Pistols. And here's the other thing that blew my mind. He was also there at Liberty Hall in Houston when the New York Dolls played a few years earlier. So, you know, I always thought that Steve Earle was kind of a country punk rocker, and, you know, apparently he really was. Frank Pugliese told me, I asked him, I said, well, what kind of an impact did it have on the San Antonio scene? He said, nah, nothing at all, same shit as always. But that's kind of Frank for you. I think the Crayolas are evidence a little bit that perhaps there was some influence. The things Jeff Smith has done, I think, are evidence. You know, the fact that there was a venue called Taco Land later on is evidence of this. But
I wanted to ask you too, so something that comes out in the story, and I was trying to read between the lines, but then you and I talked about it, is you actually did interview John Lydon himself, Johnny Rotten, about the San Antonio show, which, like, for me, what I first said when I learned that, I was like, that must be the biggest test for a music journalist. I can't imagine having to interview that guy. And you said, no, no, it's not like that.
I've never had any problems with John. I've interviewed him 4 times. I always get along great with him.
And what was his take on your telling him about the role of this show in the Austin punk scene?
He was taken aback a little bit. He was actually humbled. He was like, well, there you go. Austin got it right, you know? It took a look at what we did, and it put its own spin on it. So, more power to you, to Austin. I've always gotten along with him. I've found that if you do not try to out Johnny Rotten, if you treat him with basic respect, he's going to be just fine with you. Now, if you come at him with attitude, he's going to shut you down. Eddie Munoz is standing near the stage. He's there with his friend that he went to high school with, Ty Gavin. And there's a character named Tom Wright, who I need you to explain a little bit here. Tom Wright is this guy that was roommates in 1964 with an art college student in London named Pete Townsend. He suddenly finds himself being deported back to the States, and he leaves behind a very large blues, R&B, and jazz record archive that becomes much of the repertoire of a band that Pete is in called The Who. A few years later, The Who are touring America for the first time. They hire Pete's old buddy Tom Wright to be their tour manager. They stop in Detroit. They're playing at this place called the Grandee Ballroom there. Tom likes what he's seeing so much that he quits The Who that night and becomes the stage manager at the Grandee Ballroom, thereby ushering the Stooges and the MC5 onto the stage. A few years later, he's back in San Antonio. He's a well-known rock photographer. His assistant is this little guy named Ty Gavin. This introduces Ty to the rock and roll world. It's a stepping stone to a little band that became very, very important to this town called the Next. But anyway, so they are there at Randy's rodeo, and Tom Wright comes rushing up to Ty and Eddie saying, "Hey, here, quick! They're walking on." He opens up his trench coat. He pulls out paper plates and a thing of Ready Whip, and starts spraying it on the paper plates. "Quick, quick! We're going to get rotten the minute he walks on." Eddie Munoz was the one who threw the cream pies at Johnny Rotten that night. I busted him to Rotten when I interviewed him. I said, "I know who threw that at you." And Rotten's reply was, "Well, what a silly boy. Why didn't he come backstage and bring me? I could have done a nice slice of pie. We could have talked about how to save the world and about his horrible jealousy problem." So anyway, yeah, you've got bands forming in cars on the way back here, and this brings us up to what you're going to be reading the next week, because the Violators and the Skunks are forming. They're playing a handful of scattered gigs around town. There's a band that's left over from what Raoul's was originally, just a few months before, a rock bar called Gemini. And they're called Project Terror. It's some guys who played with Eric Johnson in a band called the what were they called? The Electromagnets. Electromagnets. And they're wanting to do something that's a little bit more stripped down, a little bit more in line with what is happening by this point. And they brought the Violators in to open on a Thursday night. Raoul's is a Tejano bar.
We have the nephew of one of the managers at the back, I believe, yes.
Hey there.
How you doing?
Which one are you related to?
Roy Gomez.
Roy. Okay. Here's something I'm good. And good to meet you, by the way. What's your name?
Rudy.
Rudy. Good to meet you, man. I'm Tim. I took your uncle down to the former Raoul's for the very first time since he sold it in 1980, and that's the opening of the chapter next week. And you are actually going to get to see video footage online of the minute Roy Gomez walked into Raoul's for the first time since 1980.
And this is a university area club for people who don't know where it was. It was on Guadalupe. I don't even know what it is now. Is it
the Mockingbird Saloon, I think it is now.
Yeah, it's changed hands a few times.
It's right next door to Kirby Lane.
Oh yeah, right next to that.
Right next door to Kirby Lane. At the time, it was next door to a Conan's Pizza.
Right.
Yeah, it's so funny because when I interviewed Carla Olson, she said, "Yeah, the pizza was good, the beer was cheap." And I brought this up to Roy, Father Roy Gomez, I might add. He is now a Catholic priest. I brought this up to Roy, and he starts laughing. He said, "We didn't serve pizza. Carla was getting that pizza from Conan's next door." Raoul's was a Tejano bar. And as Father Gomez pointed out to me, you know, the Violators did so well that Joseph Gonzalez, who was the booking manager there, as Roy put it to me, Joseph came up to me and said, "We're going to have a little bit different kind of music here coming up, just so you know." So January 28th, 1978, there is a bill booked with the Violators and the Skunks at Raoul's. This is the night punk officially enters the premises, and practically everybody who's at Randy's rodeo is in the audience, as well as a bunch of radio, TV, film students from the University of Texas across the street. And yeah, right after that, there's a band called the Body Snatchers who had previously been kind of doing like British invasion stuff and garage kind of stuff around town under a different name. They'd changed their name to the Body Snatchers, and they were like also at Randy's Rodeo, and so they kind of took on a direction that was more like the Sex Pistols or the Dead Boys or something like that. And they ended up being the third Austin punk band. And they started, and just like with the Violators, they opened a night with for Project Terror. Eventually, they started doing a residency later in the springtime with the Skunks on Monday nights, and the two bands would kind of flip a coin to decide who was going to be the headliner that night, who was going to be the opener. The nights with the Skunks and the Violators and the Body Snatchers are all getting more and more successful. The Ramones play the Armadillo in February 1978 with the Runaways opening. Chris Gates was there. Still, Chris Gates, later of the Big Boys, you know, still has long hair. He learned how to play guitar from Ted Nugent Records at that point, but he's starting to get a little tired of what's going on there, and he's hearing something cool there. A guy named Gary Floyd, who's from early, you know, somewhere else in Texas. I can't remember the exact town, maybe Uvalde.
East, yeah. Palestine.
Palestine.
Central North, all right. Yeah.
Okay, Palestine. He's there. He's just moved back here from San Francisco. He is reportedly the first person that Jesse Sublett saw in town with peroxide spiky hair. A lot of people are there. A lot more people than were at the Violator Skunk show than 2 weeks before. Joseph is noticing all of this, and so he starts booking more and more punk down at Raoul's, starts buying ads in the Daily Texan, advertising. Things just start building from here. There's a battle of the bands at, I forget the name of the club, but it was downtown, New something or other, but it's got New Atlantis. It's got, you know, the opening band is from San Antonio. They're called Chatterbox. I'm trying to figure out if that's the Vamps under a different name or not. Some of the people I interviewed seem to think it was. The Violators, Skunks, and the Body Snatchers play there. And then the headlining band is the Nerve Breakers from Dallas. And every Austin band is pissed off because the Nerve Breakers won. The Body Snatchers write a song about it called Battle of the Bands, where they're challenging the Nerve Breakers to come back for a rematch. It's on their EP, which is the first Austin punk record of the new scene, like the official, you know, after Two-Headed Dog, well, this is the next one that comes out. Reportedly recorded in 3 hours, the entire band in the same room, and it's the same studio that Two-Headed Dog was recorded at. And then the Next come to town from San Antonio. They formed in San Antonio, then came here to be a band. My plan is to write the complete history to the present of this scene. Too many of these great books like Please Kill Me or England's Dreaming, it's like, oh gee, Sid Vicious died, so that's when punk ended. And you know, if that's the case, we wouldn't have a history of Austin punk, because Austin punk doesn't begin officially until the Sex Pistols break up in San Francisco in 1978. This is when our scene begins. And as any of us in this room know, punk did not die when Sydney injected the final shot. You had hardcore coming along and making it even more radical than the original, more rock and roll based early punk sound. We have all this stuff going on. We have the garage punk revival, you know, that was kind of a big thing in Austin in that time. And, you know, sort of bands like my own crappy little combo that, you know, are reaching back to the original punk rock roots to do what we do. And no, I don't consider us like the Sha Na Na of punk rock or whatever. It's like we're making music that's inspired by 1977, but it's, as the way I feel it is we're a modern rock and roll band. We're dealing with our times, which is what punk rock is supposed to do. It's supposed to be deal with the times. It's supposed to deal with the issues that concern us now. This is the modern day urban electric folk music. You know, this is the folk music for misfits, for those that don't fit in, those that don't have a voice.
Well, thank you. I've really, every time we've spoken, I've appreciated your framing and your phrasing. And it comes out in your speech as well as in your writing, and I encourage people to continue to seek out these articles as they arrive, one on the horizon. So,
next week, and also at timnapalmstegall.substack.com.
If you want to encapsulate punk rock, it really boils down to attitude. The whole ethos of punk is like rebellion against conformity in general, meaning that the things that you grew up, you know, being taught in school, so to speak, in terms of like your moral compass and the way that democracy is supposed to work. As you get older and you find yourself disenfranchised, and then you realize to a large degree you've been deceived. The things that you were taught are really fallacy. And once you come into that realization, you have to be pissed at a spiritual level. And then when you disassociate yourself from that deception, you make a dedication to yourself to be true to yourself, to find yourself and march to the beat of your drum. And that is essentially the movement is predicated on everyone that's found their own personal direction, and we're united in a cause to keep that moving forward.
Well, also the thing about it is that there's no such thing as a punk rock club when all these things are starting up. They have to play somewhere. Richard Lloyd of television explained to me once that, yeah, they just needed a place to play, so they talked to Hilly, why don't you let us play on a Monday night or a Sunday night? They built the stage at CBGB themselves because there was no stage. There wasn't a PA there. They had to use their rehearsal PA at first. It's just they needed a place to play, and so they tried to find, all these people just try to find some place where, well, maybe things aren't working so well, maybe we can bring some people in. I mean, it's like everybody I talked to about Raoul said Joseph and Roy just, they wanted people to come in and spend some money and buy beer. And, you know, they saw that, you know, these kids were coming over from UT, from the RTF department, and, you know, buying the buck and quarter pictures of Lone Star that your uncle told me was the special there. And, you know, they were enjoying the music and everything. They just needed a place to play, and so it always paid to find some place that maybe could have done a little bit better.
This is true of the psychedelic bands in the decade before, too, because before the Vulcan Gas Company opens, those bands like Conqueror and the Elevators are playing places like the IL Club here on the East Side, or like the Doors Miller Auditorium, right? The Elevators would rent that out. I
can testify from my own experience that there was not a punk rock club in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1985. I wrote a scene report for Maximum Rock and Roll in 1986 for a scene that did not exist. I made the whole thing up, and at the end of it I said, if you are a touring band, give me a call. We'll set something up. The day after that issue of Maximum Rock and Roll hit the stands and it arrived in my mailbox, my phone rings in Alice, Texas. Hi, Tim? Yeah? Hi, I'm Eric Tunison. I'm the drummer of DeKreutzen. DeKreutzen were a big deal at that time. And so I called up 10 of my friends. We got $10 together a piece. We could rent the Galvan Ballroom, which was like this wonderful spun floor ballroom where like the Glenn Miller Band played and people like that back in the 40s.
Very historic, a beautiful ballroom.
It's still around. We knew Bobby Galvan, the son of the owners. He's now a very prominent judge down there in Corpus Christi, actually. And it was so funny because we all grew up watching the local, you know, television show dedicated to conjunto music called the Domingo Peña Show. And he was this 5-year-old kid in an imperial margarine crown in commercials for the Galvan Music, which was downstairs. You know, when we were growing up watching this show. But yeah, we rented the Galvan Ballroom. There was a local new wave covers band called the Little Ducks from Mars. We got them to do the sound. They had this really nice PA system with a board and everything. That was how I formed the Hormones. We needed an opening band. So I got a friend who played bass, who his name was Steve Fish. He later ended up the bass player in the Bowler Boys up here, and you know, a 90s ska band. And a drummer named Tommy Godley. I of course renamed him Tommy Ungodly because he was now in a punk band. And I had songs I'd been writing and stuff like that. We did 3 of my songs and 3 Richard Hell and Johnny Thunder's songs and a UK Subs song. We were the opening act. We charged, I believe, let me think here. I can't remember what the price for the tickets was, but I know at the end of the night we handed Discretion $400. We didn't take anything from the door ourselves because they had Discretion had explained to us that their van had broken down in Memphis. They had to get the van completely rebuilt. They had no tour float at that point. This was the last day of the tour. We handed them $400. And we basically saved the tour. They managed to have a profit from the tour because of this one show. That was the first punk rock show. Like official sort of local punk rock show. I mean, we had, like I said, Patti Smith had played the Ritz Theater in '78. I was there. This club called Mars, which was where the Little Ducks from Mars were the house band. They brought a few touring bands through there. They brought the Red Rockers from New Orleans through back when they were kind of America's answer to the Clash. And by the way, I'm about to write liner notes for a reissue of their debut album, Condition Red, that's coming out. Iggy Pop played there. The Members out of London. So they had a few bands coming through, but nothing really stuck. We were the first. There had been a band called Zip that was like a real pure punk band before us, but they broke up by the time we did this show. And yeah, that was the beginning of the actual scene in Corpus Christi. I've had Dale Watson note to me the similarities between punk and country music, and you know, the Nerve Breakers always wore like slashed up cowboy clothes and did these revved up versions of things like The Race Is On. You get the Hickoids eventually. You get Jason and the Scorchers, who were a big influence on the Hormones, honestly. I mean, they're like taking pure, hardcore, honky-tonk country music and playing it like the Sex Pistols.
But then, too, if you think about that Two-Headed Dog single, right? Like, seeing that as an initial punk outing, the people in the room in that session were like the crown jewels of progressive country, right? So Doug Somm's there, Bobby Earl Smith from
Bobby Earl Smith, yeah,
Frank Petoskey, the writer's there.
Yeah, Bobby Earl co-produced that record. And yeah, Joe Nick is there. I mean, I managed to get a peek into what the recording session was like from interviewing both Bobby Earl and Joe Nick in that particular chapter. But I mean, yeah, there's always been connections there. You know, I can speak from my own experience that when I came back to Austin in 2012 and people were asking me if I was going to reform the Hormones, I started thinking, well, I always did this music that aped what happened in London and happened in New York City, but what could possibly reflect the fact that I am from Texas? So that's when I started doing things like, taking Western shirts and spray painting punk rock slogans on them, and wearing cowboy boots as well. And we started taking things like Lost Highway by Hank Williams and Is Anybody Going to San Antone, and playing them as if they were New York Dolls songs or Clash songs or whatever. And I started incorporating country elements, the melodies, the storytelling and things like that into my own songwriting. I mean, it should reflect the background that you come from and the environment that you grew up in. One of the funny things, I want to talk about this with Joe Ely, because I'm going to do a chapter about the Clash being here in Austin. Joe Ely opens that Clash show at the Armadillo, and at that time, they are pretty much a standard country band. I mean, Joe's up there in a huge beaver skin cowboy hat. Jesse Taylor, his guitar player, looks like Jesus at this point. 6 months after they play with the Clash, and you've witnessed this happening yourself, they've suddenly all got ducktail haircuts, Western shirts with the sleeves hacked off. Joe has got his microphone set about here so that he has to hunch over to sing into it, and they're playing a lot more rockabilly. I mean, it went both ways.
Well, there's a lot going on, because the Stray Cats made a big impact on the Austin scene.
Yes, they did as well. I mean, rockabilly is part of the root structure of punk rock. I mean, think about it. There's this wild, primitive 3-chord music,
1977.
But yeah, I'm thinking back to 1955 here. I mean, there's nothing like some pilled-up, drunk hillbilly in Sam Phillips' echo chamber.
Well, Ray Campy made a big splash here.
Ray Campy is from Austin.
Local rockabilly, yeah.
I interviewed Ray for my Elvis story, actually. And he wasn't at the Elvis shows, but his brother was at one of them. But yeah, and Ray actually opened some shows for the Clash on that '79 tour, not here, but out in California, where he was living. And Ray Campy was also a high school teacher at that time in Los Angeles. He said that one of his students was Joan Jett. A future chapter is going to be talking about local punk media, like Neil Ruttenberg's The Reverend Neil X Show on KUT, and like the local fanzines like Sluggo and things like that. The Austin Chronicle evolved out of that, actually. There is so much to cover here. There just is.
I've seen the table of contents. It is majestic.
And it keeps growing. This next chapter, I had to only put in half the material I had planned for it. And so I had to add another chapter to incorporate the material that I had to leave out of this one.
Things that we have here. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Bevis, for joining us in this, and thank you, Sam. As the man of the hour, we all look forward to the continuing Austin Punk Chronicles. Much appreciated.
And thank you all for your interest. I'm honored and humbled that you'd be interested in anything I had to say here. Thank you, guys.